Hi, this is Alessio. Hope you're well. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the chart of Bitcoin briefly, especially the most recent drop that it had. A drop, by the way, anticipated, as you recall, in our previous videos. So in this video, I'll be discussing whether we might see lower lows on Bitcoin and also what the hourly chart of Bitcoin is telling us, plus also this chart over here and what this could be telling us about Bitcoin as well. Plus also, I'll be talking about what Bitcoin's drop could mean for this major and very important chart as well. All right, guys, join me. All right, guys, welcome back. Now, this is a very interesting chart, by the way, on Bitcoin. I'm sure that a lot of people who probably have not been watching our videos have been caught by surprise because of this major drop that occurred recently. I'm sure there's some people over the last few days after this big drop that occurred on Bitcoin who are probably feeling a bit like this.
He's done it again! That is a fact! You little bastard! He's done it again! You dirty bastard, you've done it again!
Alright guys, so as you probably recall, in my last video on Bitcoin, as a matter of fact, this was when Bitcoin was over here. Okay, you may recall what I said at the time about Bitcoin. First of all, in that video, I said that the pattern that was forming on the chart of Bitcoin, first of all, I said this bounce that was forming on the chart of Bitcoin, I said it was not convincing, that the bounce, as a matter of fact, quickly failed. On the lower time frame, it looked corrective. And also, I mentioned there were two competing wave counts. So I showed you this chart. So I explained at the time that either we were dealing with an ABC wave count in yellow, or we were dealing with a dangerous 1, 2, 3 wave count in red to the downside. And you probably remember I mentioned at the time that I was looking for a breakout to confirm direction. And I said, if Bitcoin drops below the support level at 66K and especially below 65K, then we could see a major downside move. At the very least, to test the lows we made back in May and potentially even lower. In fact, here's a very short clip of what I said before the drop occurred and also what I said in the member videos as well. Let's have a look and we'll come back. So that's the new support level that Bitcoin must protect to avoid a big drop down. Because if Bitcoin were to drop below 66 to 65K, that would actually increase the likelihood of the red wave count to significantly lower levels, at the very minimum to test the lows it made in May. So we got strong downside momentum at the moment here on Bitcoin. So I would say as long as Bitcoin stays below this near resistance, this blue line, as long as it stays below this blue line, for the moment pressure is to the downside. If Bitcoin manages to take out this support at 64K, then we could see a drop down. So below this level, it may eventually go lower to test the next support level near the May lows. In other words, this region here, the 200 SMA. All right, guys, as you heard in the member video that I posted recently, I said it was a strong warning of a potential drop in the price of Bitcoin. Why? Because this momentum signal had fired, this pulse momentum had fired to the downside, especially as Bitcoin broke down below this trend line support and it broke down below 65K. You may recall I mentioned 65K was an important support level. So as we'd anticipated, because of the breakdown below support of 65K and because momentum signals were looking negative, there was a high probability of a drop in the price of Bitcoin. And that is why I said the pressure was to the downside on Bitcoin and we were looking for a drop at the very minimum. Let me just go back on the chart here. At the very minimum to test the lows of May. Now, we haven't got to the lows of May just yet, but I think we will do pretty soon. As you can see here, we're not far away, as a matter of fact, from a 200 simple moving average and the trend line support. Let me just draw this back a bit so you can see it more clearly. It's always a good idea to zoom out. So let's go back. There we go. So as you can see here, the price of Bitcoin, first of all, by the way, I'm using here a standard chart, not a logarithmic chart. And the reason is sometimes when you use a logarithmic chart, it shows the trend lines a bit differently. But I'm using a standard non-logarithmic chart so we can see the trend lines a bit more accurately here. So you can see that's when Bitcoin broke down below the trend line support. And you can see the breakdown below 65K facilitated the drop. Now we're not far away from another trend line support, as you can see here. That brings it to approximately near 56,500 or 57K, just below the 200 simple moving average. And I'm looking, by the way, I'm looking for this trend line to be tested soon in the coming days and weeks. Now, in fact, we can see that's not far away from the lows we made in May either. So let's zoom in again on the chart. So in a nutshell, this was a drop that we anticipated based on break of support. Okay, remember, breaking of support, that's why we look at key levels. I'm sure the question you're probably wondering is, okay, but has Bitcoin bottomed? over here. I don't think so. I don't think it's likely that Bitcoin is bottom. I think we still have more downside. And I'll give you a few reasons for this. The first one is the more obvious one. If you look at the hourly chart, look at the hourly chart of Bitcoin. We made the lower low on the price of Bitcoin here, okay? Lower low. But look at the MACD, also a lower low. That means there's no divergence as yet. So we don't have any positive bullish divergence on the price of Bitcoin on the hourly chart, and that means the odds favor another lower low on the price of Bitcoin. So even if we get a bounce, I mean, we're seeing a bounce right now on the price of Bitcoin, which is normal after a big drop. The fact is, I think this bounce will eventually fail, and I think quite likely I'm expecting this low to be taken out. So I'm still expecting a lower low. Again, no divergences on the hourly time frame. Going back on the daily chart here, here's something else that's interesting. At the moment, I'm seeing 3 waves down on Bitcoin. Okay, so 1, 2, and this is likely the third wave. In my view, this is the third wave down. Now, I'm expecting an impulsive decline. Impulsive declines are composed of 5 waves. Let me show you this chart. As per the Elliot wave model, we typically see impulsive declines, especially in C waves. But the fact is, I'm still looking for another lower low, and here's why. Notice, let me just get my pen here. Okay, so if we've had so far waves 1 and 2 and 3 to the downside, and here's the bounce. I think what's happening on Bitcoin right now is the bounce, a corrective bounce. By the way, the bounce could go a bit higher. This chart shows the bounce to be rather shallow, rather small, but the bounce here on the wave 4 could be a bit bigger as long as it does not overlap. So wave 4 should not ideally overlap with waves 1 and 2 here. Okay, so ideally wave 4 bounces should stay below the low of wave 1. All right. So as long as the bounce here does not go into the territory of waves 1 and 2, I'm still looking for another decline, a wave 5 to the downside. So there it is. That's the bounce we've had so far. You can see it on the daily time frame chart. Let me just get my pen here again. So there it is. Nice bounce. You can also see it on the hourly time frame too. Again, I'm not saying the bounce necessarily has ended. We could see, in fact, let me just get my Fibonacci levels here. So if we do a Fibonacci retracement from that high to this low, you can see so far all we've done is come back up to the 38.2% retracement, which is fine. But if we see a bit more upside, which is possible, then the next level is going to be the 50% and the 61% retracement levels. Okay, if that is, we see a bit more of a bounce. All right, but I still think this bounce, as I explained, is part of a wave 4 correction before we see another drop. Okay, whether from this level or even from, in other words, from this region. Okay, so I think this region of resistance on Bitcoin for a potential wave 4, the bottom line is I'm still looking for another drop. Once this wave 4 completes, I'm still looking for another drop down to make another lower low. Okay, that's what I think is quite likely. In fact, it's quite unlikely in my view for Bitcoin to come this far and not test the 200 SMA. The 200 simple moving average, which is that green line, very close to the lows of May, and not far away from the trend line support, this white line here as well. So I have this wave count at the moment, as I explained, waves 1, 2, and 3 to the downside. I count this bounce as a wave 4, and we shall see where this bounce takes us. Again, I'm not saying it's necessarily done yet. We may see a bit more upside into these Fibonacci levels, potentially. But ultimately, I'm still looking for another wave 5 drop, whether from near current levels or from these retracement levels. Doesn't matter, okay? The fact is, I'm still looking for another wave 5 drop, eventually to take us down to test the 200 SMA and the trend line and take out. I think we'll probably take out and fall below the lows of May. All right, guys, that's what I'm looking for. By the way, that is my higher probability expectation as long as Bitcoin stays below resistance. So support now becomes resistance. As long as Bitcoin stays below 65K to 66K resistance, I'm looking for another lower low, another drop to lower levels into taking out that low of May and potentially even lower levels. And we'll talk about this, by the way, in more detail in the member videos. So make sure you check out the next member video or the most recent one for more updates on this chart. By the way, I want to bring your attention to one more important chart, which is really interesting. This is the chart of the NASDAQ. And you're probably wondering, well, why am I talking about the NASDAQ, the major stock markets? Because usually actions on Bitcoin typically precede what's happening on the stock markets. Usually when we see volatility and downside moves in Bitcoin, and as we know, Bitcoin and stock markets usually move in tandem. They're usually positively correlated. Sometimes when Bitcoin starts breaking support levels and starts dropping, that is usually a warning signal, typically a warning signal for the stock markets too. Notice, for example, how Bitcoin has dropped and taken out that recent trend line support that I just showed you here. There it is. Okay. Now, notice that we're now seeing a similar situation on the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ, which broke, so you can see the NASDAQ broke above its trend line resistance there. There it is. Okay. So broke above it and now falling below it. If we just zoom in on this chart, you can see it much more clearly. Let's zoom in. So NASDAQ broke the trend line, as we can see, and now going back below it. So it seems that was a false break. At the moment anyway. I want to see more follow through to the downside to confirm that. But a situation like this, a situation where price breaks a trend line resistance, like the NASDAQ has done, and then falls below it again, that's what's called a throwover. So in Elliott wave analysis, when price breaks resistance, a trend line, and then falls back below it, that is called a throwover, and that typically is a negative sign. It can often be a sign of increasing downside risk. Okay, now it's a bit early because we've just fallen below the trend line support. There it is. So I want to see a bit more follow through here to confirm. That is a sign of increasing risk for the stock markets and the NASDAQ. And indeed, that was preceded and warning came from Bitcoin. So I think what's happening here on Bitcoin is sending alarm bells across the other major markets, across the other major stock markets like the NASDAQ, maybe even the S&P as well in the coming several days and weeks. I hope this video has been helpful to you. Again, go ahead and check out the member updates for more details. If you're not a member, you can join that link you see right there. Thanks very much indeed. Bye for now.